It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It is the 22nd of May, year of our Lord 2026, and joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
I'm well.
How are things in Hong Kong? Summer coming?
Yeah, starting to get hot and steamy.
And that's not just your underpants, Jack.
No,
that's the natural way. I will be. And you're aware of this news, I will be in Hong Kong in December, which I'm rather looking forward to, hosting the Carbine Club, or I am one of their speakers at their lunch. So I was delighted to be invited along to that. Should be a bit of fun, and we will catch up. We might even do a record in your pub, Jack.
Yeah, we may well.
Do something like that when we're there. But today's show, of course, we're going to have a look at the budget, the reception to it, some polling around it, and then we're going to concentrate on the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion, where that's at, what some of the problems are arising from it, and then, if time permits, there's always time for sport, but if time permits, we're going to have a look at Sir Keir Starmer and Labor's woes in the UK, and whether any of the prospective leaders might be able to turn things around. So, kicking things off, Jack, the budget has not been well received, and we'll dig into that. We've got some polling out. There was a news poll on Monday that had Labor's vote pretty consistent at 31. Here we've got, this is Morgan poll, isn't it, the first one, Jack?
Yeah, it is Morgan, yep.
Labor at 29.5, One Nation 24.5, LNP 24, Greens 11, others 10.5. Two-party preferred, that's Labor 54, Liberal LNP. Or the Coalition 46, and if we were to do a further study of the two-party preferred, including One Nation, it would be 54-46 as well. There is a view among the psephologists and poll watchers that the Morgan polling company tends to tip a little bit towards One Nation, but then we get to the Demos poll, Jack, taken on the 15th and 20th of May, which has Labor running second at 26%, the One Nation at 28%, and the LNP at 23%, Greens 13%, a little bit higher, others 10%. That's a little bit of a concern for Labor, but again, I see that vote for One Nation being a little bit too high. But I think we can sort of safely say that One Nation sit in a band of around 20 to 25%, the way it stands at the moment.
Yes.
I think that's probably where they should be. But a lot of this has come out in the back of the budget, and News Poll took to asking people what they thought about the budget specifically. As I said, they also did a poll. Labor at 31, they were 34.5, 34.6, I suppose, at the last federal election. Not a lot of change there, and none really if you want to consider the margin of error. But the budget has not been well received at all. More than half of Australians, 52%, expect to be personally worse off as a result of the budget, while just 11% expect to be better off, and 37% expect to be neither better nor worse off. I suppose you can write on those stats in a number of different ways. You could actually say, well, it's been pretty well received by 48% of people, but there are some issues around Albo's performance and his approval ratings, and I notice, I presume it was perhaps a YouGov poll, one of the ones maybe Redbridge, that was published in the Sydney Morning Herald that had Angus Taylor as preferred Prime Minister, Jack.
It was in the Nine papers. I saw the headlines, but I didn't actually read the piece. But can I just say about the numbers? I actually don't think it matters all that much whether people think they're going to be worse off. That's not the test for a budget. The test for a budget is people do they think it's the right thing to do, right? And that will translate in. I mean, people don't just necessarily vote against something because it hurts them. They vote against it because they think it's the wrong thing to do. And the other thing I think is that I think Labor's chalked itself into believing that winning the last election so comfortably that they have won the battle of ideas. And the one thing that stands out for me in those polling numbers, even if you allow for some inaccuracies, is that there are as many people prepared to vote or say they're going to vote for One Nation or the coalition as there are people who are prepared to, who say they will vote for Labor or the Greens. So the battle of ideas is kind of a, not quite 50-50, but pretty close.
Yeah, I think that's pretty right. I mean, I think what's happened with the budget landing, Jack, is that the government just really didn't think that it would be as badly perceived as this one has been. I think they were really keen to push those intergenerational fault lines in our society, get on the millennials, get on the Gen X's, get on the Gen Y's, and expect to get a lot of support from them about, particularly around housing policy, the negative gearing, CGT discounts, those sorts of things. But they don't manifest, they don't land for a long time anyway. So if you're going to ask someone who's young and battling and trying to get a deposit together for a house, this budget is essentially meaningless, at least in the short term. So I can't see how they would have thought that they were going to get some benefit, some wide benefit from the electorate on that basis. While you still got people saying, well, I'm going to get taxed because I wasn't prepared to be taxed, and you said you weren't going to do it, and now you are.
The government have also floundered just in their relationship with the media. They've been getting a really good run from the media since the last election, partly because the Liberal and National government was so unpopular that the media was delighted to have somebody else. But the government seemed to go out there. They looked completely bewildered when they got some real solid pushback from people who they thought they would be nice to them. And really, that's an error. That's an advisory error, really, because whatever you do in politics, you're going to upset somebody. So you're going to get some pushback for a budget, and you should go out there expecting that.
But I thought they would expect some fairly clean demographic lines around, boomers v millennials, and that the millennials would have stood up for them. But as I said, it was also, as I said before, it's a sort of bit of all illusory, really. The only thing that matters to millennials, in terms of competing in society, is having a roof over their heads, whether either not paying a fortune in rent or having equity in a home. And that this budget certainly, you can argue whether it's going to fix that, but it's not going to fix it today, and it's not going to fix it for the next 6 months. And so we do have these grandfathering things coming in 27, 28, 29 in regard to trusts. And so I think that younger cohort of Australians are probably looking at this somewhat bewildered, and saying, well, okay, maybe, but that's a fair way down the track to be taxing trusts. And meanwhile, we'll just continue to soldier on and try and get our foot in the door around and get a house, get a roof over our heads.
Yeah, young people tend not always to think long term. That's historic. That they just don't, right?
Yeah, look, there was talk before the budget, and this, it sort of irritates me that that there's a sort of budget leaks and hints and things like that. I remember, and we'll talk about the Hockey Abbott budget of 2014, where they managed to piss off basically every demographic group, from old age pensioners down to infants, by releasing or teasing out stuff that may or may not have been in the budgets. It turned out a lot of it wasn't. And they'd managed to basically annoy everyone before the budget was released. There was a little bit of this. You might remember there were cash splashes involved, Jack. There was a hint of cash splashes. That means, generally speaking, the check's in the mail, although it might mean when you file your next tax return. So the tax cuts themselves, there are rolling tax cuts coming into the economy, but the tax cuts themselves announced in the latest budget, well, it's $5 a week. And once you file your tax return in July of this year, so it's not a lot to get excited about. Particularly if you've sort of told people, you sort of hinted that they might just be getting a little check with the Commonwealth of Australia in the top left-hand corner. So yeah, look, I guess there's some context that we need. Well, look, we'll just go through some of the commentators, and the godfather or the grandfather of them all is Paul Kelly, of course. And Paul Kelly says they won't touch, that is the Albanese government, the Keating reform method, broaden the tax base and slash the personal rates. The current Labor Party has left those values behind, and that weakens it, given the politics of aspiration. Labor has misjudged the depth of the backlash, just as Shorten misjudged, facing a revolt on multiple fronts. Taylor, of course, had his budget in reply. He has said, this is the leader of the opposition, Angus Taylor, look, honestly, this sort of nonsense about forming some kind of coalition, this is in regard to will they get together with One Nation. They've won one seat in the House of Representatives and they've got one other person who's moved from the National Party. Because Labor has described the opposition's new immigration policy as dog whistling and done to appease voters who may have left the coalition for One Nation. And they certainly seem to be doing that. But I would have thought if Labor had continued to certainly do nothing about negative gearing, and perhaps the capital gains tax, Jack, we really would have this. We would just be waving on this greater difference between the various generations, Jack, based on housing equity. Everyone who owns a home in Sydney is a millionaire. You can take that to the bank, while other people just can't get into it. And since, I think, 2004, this was in the budget papers, essentially, if you invested in a house, you've more than quadrupled your money in 20-odd years. You're not going to get that in the stock market, really. You're not going to get those sorts of returns. You're certainly not going to get it in your superannuation. So something needed to be done is what I'm saying.
There are two things about this. One, I think that the Minister for, Aged Care and Services, Sam Wright, actually used the method that used the message that the government should have used and haven't been honest enough to do. He said we need a better balance between those who earn by working and those who earn from assets. Fundamentally, this is what it's about. And that's what it seems to me to be about, and the government just hasn't said so. Yeah,
it hasn't sold it well. They really have been. I wouldn't buy aluminium siding from these guys, Jack. They're just not good salespeople, are they? No. Tanya Plibersek got on the Channel 7 Brekkie show, and it was could be good. This was at the time when the tax on trusts was sort of leaking into a sort of de facto death duty. And she was so unpersuasive, Jack, that you left the interview thinking that death wasn't all that bad either. It might be a nice little way out. I think very confused she was.
I think she was doing an outside interview underneath the third runway. And the only time the interview improved was when a plane went over the top, and we couldn't hear her. You're right to identify the huge returns people have had from investing in housing in Australia, and that's largely the result of tax incentives to do it that way. And that's the mistake that's been made, and that's hard to fix because you're going to upset people when you fix it. We would have been better off if people were putting their money into a range of investments, not putting all of their money into the one investment, which has jacked up the price.
Well, just, I did a little bit of research on this, Jack, and what's odd is that in terms of home ownership between 1975 and 1995 in Australia, there wasn't any great shift. But compare 75 or indeed 95 with 2025, and you've got rather significant shifts here in that 30 to 39 age group. Home ownership has gone down from 64% to 43%. In the 40-year-olds, home ownership has gone down from 76% to now down to 59%. While the national total of home ownership has not really changed to 71 to 67, it's more or less the same. So we are seeing younger people being kept out of the market. To some, these are quantifiable and clearly point to a problem where you will have a vast disconnect between the various generations, haves and have-nots.
But that's a factor of price. The real problem is, as you said, the price of that house has quadrupled over that period, and that's been because that's where the tax incentive is to have your money has been. Buy the most expensive house you can, rather than buy a house you can live in and put the rest in equities or commercial property or something else. And from my way of thinking, their idea of shifting the balance of taxation from income earners to spread it more evenly around over asset earners is not a bad idea. But the thing that they haven't addressed, and I think needs to be addressed, and we probably need to have a national conversation about this first, is to say we've just put too much incentive into putting money into the family home, and that's keeping people out of the market, and it's wasting assets.
That housing symposium or convention in Australia that we talked about that should have happened probably in Albanese's first term. That
should have happened 20
what
years
should
ago.
have happened. You get everyone in the room, you identify the problems, and you come up with a raft of solutions that the government can pick through. But you also have some community discussion about what's happening, so people are informed. And I think that I think we tipped that was a good way to go about it, because housing is a very, very difficult thing to fix. I'm not convinced that. Eliminating CGT on investments made beyond 27-28, on housing investments made beyond 27-28, except for new housing, is going to change supply very much. But we needed to have a proper conversation about housing, because it is a crucial thing. I mean, people talk about housing being a human right. I'm not entirely sure about that, but certainly where you've got a vast a group of people in your country that are disenfranchised, while others are sitting back enjoying government benefits with all the equity that they've got. People are that's the sort of stuff that'll lead people to the barricades, Jack.
The right to own property it ought to be a human right. But demanding somebody else give you a house is not a human right.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably about right. It took the government. It took Paul Keating to come to the aid of a government battling with
floundering government. Yes.
Yeah, with its battling with its messaging, and he took aim at wealthy people, arguing the government's change to revert to an inflation indexation CGT model with a 30% minimum rate, arguing that the Howard government's 50% discount caused house prices to increase from 9 times income to 16 times income over the 25 years. Keating said, and they want to split off startup capital and shares as if the individuals commentating have not made a feast of it already. The simple fact is that income is taxed too heavily while capital is taxed too lightly. That is the fact of it and has been the fact of it, and that distortion has made housing unavoidable for a whole generation. Thank you, Paul, for adding some important rhetoric to this, Jack. So it is a government. Look, when we're talking about good salespeople, I think Chalmers is just okay. He's certainly not Paul Keating. Elbow's terrible. Whenever Elbow gets or is a subject of criticism in an interview, he gets, his body language is terrible. He starts stammering. He finds it very difficult to stay on message. I'm not quite sure why this is happening. We do know, of course, that the government had sent out to all members of the caucus a sort of a few prompts on how to deal with the sort of lying aspect of negative gearing, CGT, etc. That these were things that they said they weren't going to touch, and then they were going to touch. We talked about lying and whether that's a significant part of a reaction from the people. But I think that's easily managed. That's easily managed, as we discussed last week. You own the lie. You say that, look, circumstances have changed, and you can hand on heart apologise, but things are so grim at the moment that we need to do these things. You can always find a rationale for it, but you've got to own the lie. It just made me think, Jack, because what's considered the great stinkers of all recent budgets, the 2014 budget with hockey handed down by hockey with Tony Abbott as leader. That was, when we look at reactions there, that was absolutely awful. And much, much worse than this budget has been received. And it was based on lies, and it was based on far more recent lies. But they didn't own the lie. They kept saying, no, we didn't lie. But there was, back then, well, we've got the 60-odd% on this budget saying they believe they'll be worse off. In the polling of similar note around 2014, they were sort of in the 80%. It was a horror budget. Always important, Jack, to look at this time. I remember that budget very well because there was the commentators were so far away from public opinion. So the commentators that I remember reading were of it's a good start, but there's a long way to go type on that particular budget, the Hockey Abbott budget. And like I say, 80% of Australians were absolutely filthy, and it almost certainly led to Tony Abbott's demise as a leader, that budget. I mean, there were other things, but that was one of them.
Well, do you remember what happened afterwards? There was a leadership spill not long afterwards.
Empty chair.
And he survived that. But then when it got to, I think, 30 negative news polls in a row, Turnbull moved again and succeeded.
Yeah.
And so he became Prime Minister and sacked Joe Hockey as Treasurer. So they both lost their job over that.
Yeah. And again, it's the big part of that. I mean, it wouldn't have changed perceptions around the budget, but if they had have been a bit more forthcoming about the lies that they told, it could easily have come down to sort of rhetoric. Look, we didn't realise how bad things were until we had a look at the books, and now, unfortunately, and own it that way. But they didn't do that. And, we did also have Joe Hockey and the current secretary of the Austrian-born, Belgian-born finance minister,
Matthias Cormann.
Matthias Cormann. He's secretary of the, I was going to say OPEC, and I knew that's not right. But anyway,
one of the European supernatural national.
No, it's bigger than that. It's he's it's a group of nations that Australia belongs to economically. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's not important. But they were seen chomping on cigars and things like that. It was just a dreadful look, Anyway, just going forward, Jack, they need to arrest this a little bit, don't they? And they need to get some clear and better messaging out. That's the government. So how do they go about that?
Get them all in a room and start again and say, this is what we're going to do. First of all, get someone to come up with a clear plan of something that's something that's sellable, some
Maybe
version
forget the intergenerational focus. I think that's been a mistake.
Well, I think Sam Ray got it right, saying that, and Paul Keating's got it right, said the same thing. We have to, we thought what was needed was to shift income tax from not just from income earners, but onto asset people who get their income from assets. And you can sell that message. Not everyone's going to like it, but you can go out there and sell that. But
how many people have got trusts in Australia? What percentage of Australians have got
very few,
trusts?
I would have thought. Yeah,
it's just under 10%.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with these things, whether discretionary or family trusts or whatever vehicles are being used. Most Australians have no experience of this sort of stuff.
And I think they exempted agricultural pursuits. So trusts are very common in the farming world.
They
need
can
that,
be in some small
because they need that
too.
for succession purposes, right? So it's the only really valid, only really worthwhile way of doing a succession plan. But I think they're exempted anyway. That's what I recall.
Well, I imagine it's like the family home, Jack. So let's say Farmer John dies and his son or daughter comes forward, the farm would be either handed over, which could be sold, and then subject to CGT. But if the farm remains in the family's hands, there's no CGT as it passes over from the death of the patriarch to his children.
Yeah, no, don't want to go into this because the succession plans for family agricultural products are quite complicated. But I believe they've been exempted, so that's a large chunk of the people who've got trusts, right? So you're right. Aside from them, it's the other thing. Of course, it does hit small businesses, and I don't know that it's going to raise enough money out of the trust stuff to make it worthwhile. But they're going to have to rethink some of this stuff and then work out a way to sell it. One thing they've got to rethink, I think, is the NDIS. I saw the figures for the NDIS this week. For the NDIS recipients who are high school students or not pre-university people. Of all students with a disability, 10% are social, emotional, and 15% are cognitive. I think most people, when the NDIS started, really thought this was going to be looking after basically people with physical disability and a few others. But when a quarter of them are not physical disabilities, I think that figure will shock people and they won't be happy.
Oh, I'm not so sure that'd be the point of distinction that I'd focus on. I mean, clearly there are intellectual disabilities, and they are as common, if not more so, than physical disabilities. There are a growing number of people who are suffering from chronic conditions. The pandemic has brought long COVID to our lives, and there are other existing chronic conditions that are becoming more widespread. MECFS is one, fibromyalgia, these sorts of things that are debilitating for young and old people. the big thing for me around the NDIS, Jack, is that they expect over the forward estimates to save, 37 billion? I think 36.8 billion is the... And I just don't know how you do that without a hell of a lot of noise from the disabled sector. And that's bad news. That's kind of the sort of news that a government doesn't want, vulnerable people having to advocate for themselves because they've been left out of the NDIS, or they have been removed from the NDIS, or they can't get into the NDIS.
The only way it can be fixed is to go back to the beginning and say, this is who is eligible, and work out what you can afford to spend money on.
Yeah, but you can't do it by sort of ignoring intellectual disabilities, is the point I'm trying to make, Jack, and say, well, if you can't climb up a flight of stairs, then you get the NDIS. I mean, I just don't see that's the right way to define disability, but there needs to be a supply of services that are indicative of the level of disability, is what I'm saying, and that there are some people who are on the NDIS with relatively minor disabilities, relative to people who are chronically bedridden, for example, and so I think there are a large number of people who cannot right now access the NDIS, Jack, because the conditions that they have are too difficult or take too long to define. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, known as chronic fatigue syndrome, is one such example. It will probably take a sufferer 5 years to get a diagnosis. And their conditions, when they have severe ME, is essentially being bedridden or house-ridden for their lives. And that comes with its own set of difficulties, but they are not getting into the NDIS, whereas a kid with a fairly mild form of autism on the spectrum is getting it, is getting the full raft of services. And I think there's an issue with that. So it's for more profound minds than us, particularly in the medical and scientific areas, to actually set out definitions of disability and then work out where the money can best be spent. I think that's what needs to happen. But I agree with you. It's almost we're at the point with the NDIS where you've got to chuck it away and start again.
I think we are at that point. And ultimately, these decisions should be informed by science, but these are political decisions. This is what you got to spend the taxpayers' money on, and that's always a political question.
All right. Now we are going to move now on to our discussion on anti-Semitism and the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion, established, it must be said, with a little bit of reluctance, quite significant reluctance from the Albanese government initially. And we've discussed that, Jack, because
try kicking and screaming. Yeah.
Well, yeah. But I think a lot of people now are looking at this Royal Commission and saying, oh, it's all a bit. I think people have perceptions around Royal Commissions that they are like interrogations and where people will be stripped bare in the witness box and scandals will be exposed and all of this sort of stuff. And it's just so far away from the history of Royal Commissions in this country.
I mean, some Royal Commissions have been game changers in Australia, but people generally have more faith in things like Royal Commissions and the legal system than is justified. I mean, they just can't fix everything, right?
No. And often they're set with very fixed terms of reference and very fixed funding and so forth. So when we talk about some of the significant Royal Commissions in recent times, we look at the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Offending. I guarantee you most victims who have gone through that process are unsatisfied with what happened. They supported a Royal Commission when it was announced, only to find that it really wasn't quite what they were expecting. one of the things that was absent there was no examination of the role of policing around child sex offending in institutional offending. And for the life of me, I still don't know why that happened. The terms of reference allowed it. There is some talk that some of the premiers told Gillard that they didn't want the police to be subject to the investigations of the Royal Commission. Maybe that's true. But in the end, people were left unsatisfied. People who probably did expect to have their voices heard, found there were a lot of other voices there sort of trying to ignore them.
Public ed was the same thing.
Yeah.
Victims from public education system felt the same way.
Well, the Royal Commission into Banking, Jack, we might look back at that and say, how come the ANZ was still given large amounts of government bonds, essentially, to invest and basically ripped off the Commonwealth? And that was after the Banking Royal Commission, Jack. So not a lot got solved there. So this was established.
So it's unrealistic to expect the legal system or Royal Commissions to fix all these problems. They just don't. What they can do is they can shine a light on some problems. And to be fair, overall, the Royal Commission into the institutional abuses, etc., was a real positive because it shone the light on a lot of things that weren't getting exposed.
That's
right?
true.
So you look at this and say, is it going to work? Well, it's not going to cure anti-Semitism in Australia by any means, but if it shines a light and causes a conversation to happen that addresses some of the real issues in it, then that will be worthwhile.
Yes. I guess my only other criticism of the Royal Commission, Jack, is that one really important thing can't be examined, and that is the role of the alleged murderer and his father, who was shot dead at Bondi on December 14, because that is subject to criminal proceedings.
Yeah.
So that restricts it again, and I thought perhaps the best way to handle this was to allow for which is what the government planned, allowed for a proper study of the agencies, the security agencies, ASIO, and their relationship with police, state and federal, and that would be allowed to go. Then we would have the criminal trial, and then we could have the Royal Commission, Jack. But people were, well, Wayne Carey in particular was determined that we have a Royal Commission, Jack.
So who was that?
Wayne Carey. Wayne
Carey.
There was a long
I don't
list
recall
of sports people who said we need to have a Royal Commission.
Okay.
And then on a podcast he did with Sam Newman, he came out and banged the table, insisting that a Royal Commission had to be underway.
I've just got a tip for you. If you're listening to a podcast with Wayne Carey and Sam Newman, if any of our listeners are doing that, have a good look at your life.
Yeah, mirrors required. Walk around in the room of mirrors. All right, so there were limitations on this straight away, and then they couldn't examine the incident itself, essentially. There have been some reports, Jack, that in fact, I just read one in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning saying that ASIO had cut its counter-terrorism funding to its lowest level since 9/11. And the timing of that, obviously in hindsight, is problematic, but I can't for the life of me, if we go to a time before the Bondi attack, you would still think, gee whiz, we've got a fair bit to investigate here. But I guess ASIO would argue that funds are limited and they had to make some decisions around that.
There are always uncomfortable decisions to make of that kind, right? And sometimes you get them wrong.
Sometimes you get it wrong, but your whole business model is based on intelligence gathering and cooperating with other agencies, so state police in terms of counter-terrorism. They are more on the ground than anybody thinks. In the wake of 9/11, we created a national security hotline, and people there were encouraged to report anything that they thought was suspicious. There was some rather strange advertising around this, Jack. It was not exactly building trust among fellow Australians. But there was a time there where and I've actually rung the National Terrorist Hotline on a couple of occasions with genuine concerns. The first time I did this was during the pandemic, and I got to tell you, the bloke I spoke to, he couldn't have cared less what I was telling him, and what I was telling him was a week before the fire in the old Parliament House that bad things were going to happen there, and he went, "Oh well, you know." So then after Wyambilla, where Gareth Nathaniel and Stacey Train shot dead two police officers and a neighbour, I rang with concerns about a particular individual in a sort of similar sort of scenario. And look, by half an hour later, I was talking to a New South Wales counter-terrorism officer. So there are times when, I don't know, when I go back to Bondi before when I go back to Australia before December 14 at Bondi, you can still see risks from extremist groups, right-wing extremist groups like neo-Nazis. You can see a burgeoning group on the left. You can see that that the collapse of Islamic State may have led to a reduction in the foment of terrorism in the Western world, but it was still a significant threat. So I'm not quite sure how ASIO gets away with arguing that, Jack.
No.
Okay, so we just want to remind our listeners of the terms of reference to this Royal Commission, which is due to complete and file its report by December, but can go further. The Commission examines four main areas: the nature, prevalence and drivers of anti-Semitism in Australian society and institutions, including extremism and radicalisation; recommendations for law enforcement, security, border control and immigration agencies to better tackle anti-Semitism; the specific circumstances of the Bondi attack. Well, as we just said, that is very, very constrained by criminal proceedings; broad recommendations to strengthen social cohesion and counter extremism; and finally, it also incorporates aspects of a prior review into federal law enforcement and intelligence. Nowhere there, Jack, do I see, there's recommendations for law enforcement, but what we do now know is that, in fact, we knew this not long after the Bondi attacks took place, is that the private security company that is used extensively by the Jewish community, particularly in Sydney, had raised alarms directly with New South Wales Police, and they in fact informed police that they were concerned that the festival that was being planned at Bondi, the Jewish Hanukkah festival, was particularly vulnerable to attack, and it would seem that New South Wales Police did not respond. So I read that. I'm not quite sure why that's not a bigger headline, Jack. Because I
would have thought that that's a suitable line of questioning for the council assisting.
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to name a police officer, but there was one in particular who basically, listened to the concerns and then did not very much at all. In fact, there were only 3 police officers available at the Bondi police station on the day of the attacks. And a very small cohort at the Rose Bay police station, which is a bigger police station. And so, it was very much a ball-dropping exercise. So we can at least sort of glean that these things were not taken seriously, or the concerns were not dealt with in any significant way by police on the ground at the moment. Now, I'm not suggesting that the motivations were anti-Semitism. I'm probably more explaining that the reasons for that were police bureaucracy.
In the interim
own budget. Sorry, go on.
In the interim report, I think which was released at the end of April, there were a number of recommendations that were redacted for security reasons,
Yes.
and they included. I kind of hoped that they might have addressed part of those issues, but perhaps we don't know.
We don't. Yeah, and we don't know. We don't know. You would like to think again. It's not about disciplining or removing certain police officers from the force. They have to learn from this. It's an appalling situation, but they have to learn from this, and presumably they will. But where you've got Jewish holidays, the fact that we have in Bondi and in the Jewish community around Australia, security guards to protect kids going to school and leaving school and those sorts of things, that should have been a bit of an eye-opener for us in the first instance, right? And that's been going on for years. We've talked about some of the history of this. The firebombing of the Hakoah Club in the 1990s, I think. There's a synagogue in Queensland, Jack, that's been the subject of an arson attack on numerous occasions going back to the 1920s. So there's been a problem for a while, hasn't there?
Yeah. If there's one thing I would like to come out of that, or a number of things, is that Jewish kids can go to synagogue or school without having to have armed guards out the front, and that Jewish students and academics can go about their business at universities without being
subject to harassment.
Harassment, yeah.
And that for you, that would be the measure of the
that would be a
success of a Royal
start.
Commission?
But if they achieve that would be worthwhile.
I don't think that's achievable, quite frankly. I don't think that's something that would change. If anything, I think the security details would be ramped up. But let's look at how pervasive anti-Semitism has become in this country. I saw I think a parent who was also a football coach from Ajax. Ajax is a storied history in sport in Australia. Those who represent it, Jewish people for the most part. Supplied a few league footballers on the AFL footballers along the way. And there was a guy, as I said, he was the football coach of I think an under 13 or under 14 side, 13-year-old kids, and one of the kids from one of the opposition kids went up to one of the Ajax kids and said, "Are you a Jew?" And he goes, "Yes, I am." And he goes, "Hitler should have finished you off. Hitler should have finished you all off." These things don't come from through the womb, Jack. But they are learned along the way, and they've been learned by people who are, not adults, a long way from becoming adults. So that tells you how pervasive it's become. Anti-Semitism, can we conclude that it is worse now than it has been, in the last 50 years?
Yes.
Okay, so what would you put that down to? What are the reasons?
We've always had anti-Semitism on the right, the kind of neo-Nazi types, and that's grown on the right, but it's particularly, and it's grown quite a bit on the right, but the anti-Semitism on the left, in the progressive left, didn't really exist like this 30 years ago. Victoria, the left, the most progressive part of the Labor Party, was a haven for Jews in the 70s, 80s and 90s, right? There were Jews littered right through all of the Labor institutions in senior roles, right? And those days have gone. I mean, there's still a few, but not very many at all. I mean, this is my tribe. I'm disturbed at how anti-Semitic they've become.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that we have is that when we think about anti-Semitism from the right, we immediately think of neo-Nazis. And we know, fortunately, that neo-Nazis are a relatively small section of the Australian community. But anti-Semitism has hurtled away from neo-Nazism, and it is still being embraced by the right, by the hard right, I should be said. And it's supported, like it is in the left, from these sorts of tropes that the Jews run the world, the Jews run banking, these sort of nonsense tropes that are put about and legitimised by the sheer weight of the number of times people say them. We're seeing this in, I wouldn't describe Tucker Carlson as a neo-Nazi, certainly not, but he is a representative of one of those groups on the hard right that continually pervade these tropes about Jewish people, that they are at the centre of everything, and Benjamin Netanyahu is a sort of global puppeteer and all this sort of stuff. And as you say, the left, particularly in academia, has basically, I guess, taken up the cudgels on behalf of the oppressed, and they regard the Palestinian people as oppressed, and a very solid argument could be made that they are. But somewhere along the way, Jack, the arguments about the role of the Israeli government and whether you're for or against them has transferred into individuals who are Jewish. I mentioned to you a story of a friend of mine who's a highly regarded oncologist, lives in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. She's Jewish. She spends a lot of time when she's not working saving people's lives in charitable works and so forth. And after the October 7 attack by Hamas attack on Israel, and the immediate response from the Israeli government, she found herself, as you mentioned, as a progressive left person, she found herself on social media having to sort of try and explain that Jewish people don't necessarily follow Benjamin Netanyahu and they can't be lumped into the same group. And the responses were, you support the killing of babies. And in the end, she just gave up. I mean, it's no point talking to people if they're going to accuse you of infanticide. So, yeah, there's something even more pervasive about this than we imagine on the right. And there is certainly a booming group in the left when we talk about some of the leftists in the UK, Jack, some of those who are no longer welcome in the Labor Party over there. There is a pronounced streak of anti-Semitism among them.
This is very difficult for a lot of Jews because, if you poll Jews in the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, for instance, they poll very progressive. These are bedwetting liberals, basically. By and large.
Well, I would not describe them as bedwetting liberals. What I would describe them as is intelligent people who've made their own assessments about the way a society should be going.
Well, they are tribally progressive. And for them, this has been very, very difficult because they've been prepared to march and support every progressive cause in the world, right? And now when they think they deserve some support, they don't get it. This started very early on after October 7. Progressive Jews in New York were putting up hostage photos on walls and things like that, little pen pictures, a whole, of the 50 hostages or whatever. And their neighbours were coming around after them, tearing them down and abusing the Jews for putting them up.
Yeah,
this is
nice
really
old
difficult.
stinks there with people gathered around being confronted as to why they were tearing down these photos or these posters.
This has been very difficult for progressive Jews. They kind of feel lost, I've got to say, at the moment.
And the first thing is they don't support Benjamin Netanyahu.
No, they don't.
They support, some don't, but most will support the state of Israel. But there has been this fusing of ideas that Zionism and Jewish ethnicity are the same things.
Yeah, if you want to hear some criticisms of Benjamin Netanyahu, come with me on a Thursday or Friday night. I'll take you for a drink, and you'll get your right ear will be given a thorough battering from Jews prepared to tell you how wrong you are about that. But it's nothing to do with that anymore.
I think it's got a substantial. I think that there has been a substantial contribution to that shift from people who, quite rightfully oppose Zionism or oppose a sort of adventurous Zionism to now being just labelled as supporters of genocide, etc. In Gaza. This is, I think, the consequence of Israel's strike back into Gaza, and clearly there were some horrendous things that have occurred there. But to suggest that anyone who is Jewish blindly supports that is just bizarre to me.
And to be honest, the people who say, we're into this because we think the Palestinians are oppressed and this is terrible, it doesn't quite stack up, because there are a lot of people oppressed around the world and you don't give a rat's about those. So it's just unconvincing. The only people you care about are the Jews.
What about universities, Jack? I mean, universities should be sort of hotbeds of free thinking and the expression of often sort of fringe concepts. But again, we're seeing Jewish academics being, having to cover up who they are, not wearing their Stars of Davids or their yarmulkes, those sorts of things. Or if they do, they are being confronted by a wave of other academics and students as well. I mean, how do we fix that without being heavy-handed around university, around enforcement and funding and those sorts of things?
Well, I don't know whether you read the Greg Craven piece.
Yeah, I did.
Greg Craven's I think he was the Chancellor or Vice Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, and he's a long-standing academic of high standing, all that kind of stuff. He thinks the universities failed. I'm certain they failed. I was following what was happening at my old university, University of Melbourne, and they utterly failed to keep their Jewish students and staff safe. It's one thing to tolerate people having odd ideas. Universities should do that, but you must be able to keep your minority students and staff safe, and they didn't do it. Greg Craven recommended, and I think Jason Clare's taken this up, that they do get a bit heavy-handed, that they say, we're going to tie some of your funding to your capacity to get this right. And to me, I think that's fair and reasonable. Okay.
Meanwhile, of course, Palestinian academics have been nominated for the Miles Franklin Award, Jack.
Seriously, mate, any of those awards, the Pulitzer has no credibility anymore.
I'd knock it back too. Yeah, I'd knock it back. Yeah. Haven't been nominated for a Miles Franklin, but I would do some sort of solid political stuff to avoid a lot of this stuff. I've tried to make the point that when it comes to writers' festivals and things like that, writers' festivals, look, I know a lot of people like to meet authors and talk about literature, and that's great. But for the most part, these sort of book weeks and things like that, they're the most boring days you could possibly imagine. And I say that as an author. There is nothing more boring than hearing writers talk about themselves. There really isn't. And I'd be more fascinated listening to a chippy carpenter and some of the difficulties they have in their day. But yeah, I don't know why we apply this kind of status to scribblers. I am one myself, but it's it ain't right.
Well, when you think about it, who do you want to hear from? Someone who's active in the world involved in politics or the law or medicine, operating on people, doing something exciting, or someone who spends their time in the spare room at home tapping it away at a computer. It's just not quite the same thing in terms of living an interesting life, is it?
Yeah, I've never really understood it. But anyway.
But look, there's a market for it and people want to go and do it, and that's okay. And so far, but people get really upset about the Writers' Festival and think that they've got to be more even-handed, and perhaps they do. But these are commercial businesses, the Writers' Festivals, in a sense, and they know what their market is, and their market likes a good, healthy dose of anti-Semitism and doesn't want anything else much.
All right. Well, the Royal Commission's featured some harrowing stories of Jewish Australians and the problems they've encountered and the problems their children have encountered, offensive sort of behaviour of the kind I mentioned for the kids playing for Ajax Footy Club. This sort of stereotypical response, Hitler salutes, all this sort of stuff. But there are institutions. Should our institutions be having a long, hard look at themselves, Jack? Certainly there is a view, and I think Shari Markson has prepared this view, that there is an institutional bias against Israel within the ABC.
Yes. Well, I think there is.
But is that anti-Semitic?
Well, I'm not in favour ever of using. There's two words I think we'd be better off without. One's anti-Semitic, and the other one's Islamophobia. I think they're deleterious to debate because we get lost in definitional things, and I don't think that's helpful. We should just treat everybody, all minority groups and all majority groups, much the same. I would say about the ABC being biased against Jews and against Israel is, I just think it's wrong. It's unfortunate, and they ought to be better than that.
We are dealing with, when we talk about numbers of Israelis compared to the Arab world, Arab population in the Arab world, we are talking about a minority. So when ethnic groups come through Australia, obviously there are going to be those with Arab backgrounds. Going to be more of those than there are Israelis, those from Israel or Jewish people. And so, in a sense, I'm not trying to justify this in a way, but you can understand how the ABC, just as one media organisation, has got a number of employees, I should say, in that business, whether they're acting as journalists or producers or whatever role they've got. They are going to outnumber the number of Jewish people working in that same institution. So in a sense, that bias is almost sort of organic.
And the ABC is, it tilts a little anti-Western world, and for a lot of people right around the world, Israel is seen as the front line of the West, and that it ought to be kicked out of the Middle East because that would be better for the world to give the West a bloody nose, if you like, right? And that's inevitable in the ABC. But I think they should be a lot better at countering that.
Yes. The other thing I find about the ABC is that, and it's not necessarily related to this issue, but it has become intensely bureaucratic, Jack. And there are lever arch files of rules and regulations for broadcasters that are so convoluted that they're almost impossible to understand. And then they have these other committees to determine whether there's sufficient diversity in broadcasts, that there's if there are three thin women in one drama piece, there should be a fat one, and all this sort of stuff. It really is quite a mess. All in the name of diversity, which is a wonderful thing, and we should promote it. But when you bureaucratise it, it leaves you with really unsatisfactory outcomes.
There was a wonderful interview I saw during the week of two Danish filmmakers being interviewed, and question number 3 was about the lack of diversity in their new film, in the acting, right?
I saw that, yeah.
And they're all white, of course. And the director said, this was Denmark set in 1750. And just left it at that to general laughter. But so, of course, they were all white.
There's been sort of similar reaction from the right, people like Carlton and others, because Homer's Odyssey is being filmed. I think it actually it's in McCann now, and I can't remember the character, but one of the characters played by a black actor. And this is met with all sorts of silliness, this sort of focus on skin color and all this sort of nonsense. The same people who believe Jesus Christ was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy,
well, he was. I've seen the statue.
Well, yeah, I know my children's Bible. So. When that is very, very unlikely from a lad from Judea around 2,000 years ago. All right, well, that we just kind of wrap this up, Jack, very quickly by saying the Royal Commission is not going to solve anti-Semitism. It's not going to solve racism. It's not going to solve it's not going to solve Islamophobia. It's not going to solve those sorts of profound issues. And I dare say that will be made even more difficult while we're having conversations about immigration, which is kind of shorthand for xenophobia anyway.
I don't accept the last premise. I think there are genuine arguments to be had about
I'm not saying they're not. Sorry to interrupt. I'm not saying they're not, but these arguments are often embraced by racists and xenophobes in the country and politicised, used as a vehicle. I mean, I think Pauline Hanson is one we can safely target with that sort of allegation, and we need to be very, very careful. And I was really interested to hear your views about this, because if what we don't want to do is have particular focus on a particular ethnicity.
No.
And legal responses, and they receive more support while others don't. I mean, did anyone, while Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison were running around calling, mouthing off about African crime gangs, Jack, did anyone say, "Gee whiz, that's a bit fruity. That's a bit on the xenophobic side"? Well, there was political capital, they thought, to be made.
This is why I don't accept that we should be using terms like anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. I think we should be treating people equally, right? Yes. Look, some of this stuff's difficult, but you were talking before about the ABC having leverage files full of stuff. To me, that's always an indicator, is that you've got people in the organisation in positions of responsibility who are incapable of making a decision for themselves.
Correct.
So they have to hide behind regulations so they can avoid making a decision. But there should be senior people there in any media organisation, that there should be an editorial process where someone has the job of saying, no, that doesn't make it. Or yes, that does make it. I think it's a bit risky, but we should do it. But someone's got to make that decision and stand by it.
Yeah, good stuff. And I also would say too that we can't say as a marker that this Royal Commission will do away with those things that we should be a bit ashamed of in this country. That there are security groups charged to protect Jewish kids. from persecution, from being yelled at, screamed at, assaulted, etc., harassed, harangued. I don't think that we'll get to that point immediately, but we should at least have a better understanding that these are vast historical issues, that the Jewish people have been subject to pogroms, isolation, ostracisation, violence, really for thousands of years. One of the great sad ironies of history is that the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania was established in the 17th century, Jack, not quite constitutionally enshrined, but promoting the idea of religious tolerance. This was in the time of the Counter-Reformation, I should say. And so a lot of people came to Poland, went to Poland because, including Jewish people, Muslims, Protestants, etc. Poland is substantially a Roman Catholic country, but in this centuries ago visionary sort of view, this was the place to go where you wanted to avoid persecution. And of course, the sad and tragic irony of that was when Hitler swept into Poland in 1941. At the same time, and people often forget this, that the Soviets owned half of Poland prior to that, and were particularly awful to Jewish people there too. So all these people have fled for religious persecution and profound cultural links to the country in Poland. And I think there were some 800,000 Jews in Poland in 1941, and by 1945 there were just a couple of hundred left.
I mean, there are almost no the Jews used to live happily in the Middle East, in the Arab countries in the Middle East. There's almost none.
Well, there's a significant
all the way from Morocco right through.
There's a significant Jewish diaspora in Iran. There's one in Shanghai, Jack.
The Shanghai one's interesting because a lot of those came out of Russia from as early as the Russian Revolution and moved to Shanghai.
All right. Well,
some of them ended up in Sydney, but a lot of them stayed in Shanghai.
We did promise that we were going to do Keir Starmer and Labor's woes, but we're going to put that back to next week. Well, we'll probably have we'll have a decent look. We don't want to just spend a couple of minutes on that. So we're going to move that to next week. Nothing much is going to change, I don't think, Jack, in the next week. I don't think. Well, I think Starmer's still got the fingernails stuck to the chair, and there are a few people coming at him.
It's not going to get any better for him in the next 7 days.
Not going to get any better, but we wouldn't expect him to be gone by next week, I wouldn't think. He's being hunted by Andy Burnham, that we've talked about a bit, Mayor of Greater Manchester. But he's got his own woes just getting back. But I did see, so you've got it in there. And we'll talk about it next week in real depth. But you put Andy Burnham in the leader's position, and Labor's vote goes up to about 30% from the doldrums. Whether that's genuine or not, I don't know.
I think that's.
I've never heard of more in common, but it's 2,600 people.
Yeah, I think it's that might be a measure of just how extraordinarily unpopular Keir Starmer is.
I think that's what it is. You could sort of say anyone else. Would you like Keir Starmer or anyone else? All right, so we'll deal with that next week, Jack and listeners, and we'll move directly on to sport. Well, firstly, let's start with the Premier League, because it's all done and dusted while they've still got a game to play. And Arsenal are the winners. It looked like Man City were going to hunt them down, but in the end, they remain strong. And I think they've got a chance of winning the Champions League. I think that final's in a couple of weeks. So Arsenal have had a ripping season. First time they've held up the Premier League. I think it's a shield rather than a trophy. Maybe wrong.
It is actually, yes.
And they'll be holding that up. This was after Man City drew with Bournemouth, and I looked at Man City's draw, and they were playing some sides that that had a bit to play for, and that's one of the things about the Premier League. Whether they can avoid relegation, whether they can get into Europe, whether they can get into Europe twice through the Euro and through the Champions League and those sorts of things. There are always things like that swinging. So Bournemouth drew with Man City, and that just meant that Arsenal were too far ahead, and there's just one game to play. I think Arsenal are playing Aston Villa in their last round, and that's no gimme either because Villa still have a fair bit to prove this season, and they of course had a ripping win, Jack. They beat German side Freiburg to win the UEFA Europa League. Aston Villa had a terrific season.
Yes.
And what's left for the season is to worry about who's going to get relegated, and the money, the smart money is on West Ham. West Ham play Leeds this weekend. Spurs play Everton. Spurs are just ahead on the points tally. I'd expect that just basically as you were sort of thing. So West Ham will be relegated into what used to be second division. I can't remember what they call it now.
As a Liverpool, it's called the Championship. As a Liverpool
right,
betting friend said to me the other day, he says, they'll both lose, mate, and Spurs will stay up.
Well, perhaps they should do the table, Jack, based on how much you're paying for your players and how many wins you get. Work out some sort of ratio on that basis. I mean, Spurs, the knock on Spurs has been that financially it's a reasonably well-run club. But that's because they don't pay the big transfer fees, and that's because they don't pay the big salaries, and that means you're not going to get the world's best players. Whereas Liverpool, they've got a salary bill of 428 million quid every season, well, this season anyway, and that doesn't include some of these huge transfer fees, but they've ended up, they'll probably end up fifth on the table. So it's not always just a question of how much money you can spend on players. When we talked about Villa, you pointed out to me before we went on air that Freiburg, what do they pay in salaries?
Freiburg, the losing team in the
Europa League,
was they paid 20 million quid, and Aston Villa's wages bill is 273 million quid.
Yeah, so there is. Look, sport is not simply a matter of the best paid people playing people who aren't, and expecting to win. It doesn't always work that way, and we saw that with Bournemouth drawing with Man City. But it goes a long way towards that. But at the same time, when we look at Liverpool, who have got the biggest payroll of any of the Premier League clubs, Man City second, that it doesn't always lead to multiple trophies in the cabinet.
No, it doesn't.
All right. Moving on to the NRL. Well, the ARL, I think is the right way to put it. The State of Origin squads are all being named, Jack. The couple of debutants for the Blues, Laurie Daly, the coach there, Victor Radley's come in, James Tedesco's back, Brian Toll he's a fantastic footballer. I love watching him play. And over in the Queensland Maroons, you just got the feeling that the Melbourne Storm season, which was going horribly, has just corrected itself enough to allow some of their halves to be playing. But Reece Walsh, who was the gun 2 years ago, Jack, has been left out.
Yeah, saw that. A bit surprising. I mean, he hasn't been in great form, but I thought he would get a game just on the basis of how effective he was in Origin.
Yeah, it is an odd one, but we'll see. Game one is set for May 27 in Sydney, and more broadly in the NRL, Penrith are going beautifully. The Warriors are going very, very nicely too. So they thrashed the Broncos 42-2, and that tells us a little bit about the Broncos. And the other side that's going beautifully, Jack, are the Dolphins. And the Knights too, Newcastle Knights. I mean, they've got some long-suffering supporters. Haven't had a cheer since the Johns brothers retired, more or less. They're going okay at the moment. What's Magic Round, Jack?
This is they put the whole thing on at Suncorp, I think, or Suncorp and one other stadium. It's a bit like the AFL Gather Round, although the Magic Round did come first. It seems to go okay.
I just love the naming, Magic Round. Why is it magic?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know. Some things the market has come up with, I just can't keep tabs on.
I mean, it seems to work. I mean, I couldn't think of anything worse than going to the footy and sitting there all day watching match after match after match myself. But there you go.
Well, one of the worst games of rugby league I actually saw, NRL. This was just of the days just around Super League. So I went along to the old Sydney Stadium and watched. It was the Rabbitohs playing one of the defunct Super League clubs. Might have been Gold Coast, this or that. And the Rabbitohs bunny mascot was smoking a cigarette, leaning up against the fence, Jack, for most of the game. It was quite something to see. All right. In the AFL, Jack, Hawthorn had a win in Launceston last night. Beat the Adelaide Crows. They started a bit slowly. Bloody cold out there, but they won't be playing at Launceston for much longer.
So the AFL has announced they don't want any distraction from what the Devils are going to do. Hawthorn are very popular, of course, in Launceston, and it's been very good for the Launceston economy because a lot of visiting fans come in and Hawthorn fans go down first of all, and visiting fans come with them, right? And it's been great for tourism in the district.
But they've also been quite good about. I mean, it's not as if it's been their genuine home away from home.
It has,
and they've gone down when they've won flags. They've gone down with the cups and the players and celebrated with the people of Northern Tasmania. And
of course, during the time they've been playing down there, they have won 4 premierships. So that helps.
You can't back them not to win in Launceston. They just win. They did last night. I don't know what the record is, but I reckon there'd be at least out of 10 games there, they would have won 9. So it's a happy hunting ground for them as well. But I understand the AFL's position.
Yeah, so
this has to be a whole of Tasmania approach. It can't be a Southern Tasmania /Hobart thing. So I understand that, but it is difficult for Hawthorn.
And of course, the relationship between the people of Launceston and the people of Hobart's a little fractious. So that if you give an excuse for there to be 2 Tasmanias, there will be 2 Tasmanias, right?
Well, some say, I don't, but some say they've got the heads for that, Jack. Yes, look, we can't go any further without acknowledging Carlton had a win under their interim coach, Josh Fraser. Lots of reasons for this. I did look at the stats on this, Jack. People say, if you sack the coach, you're going to win the next round. In the last 12 occasions that's occurred, it's 6 apiece, 6 wins, 6 losses. So it doesn't transfer directly to a loss. I guess there is a bit of release of pressure, but there's also a sense that, if they've sacked the coach, they won't have too much trouble delisting me if I'm not performing. So,
but I've got to say, if they've won half of them, that's actually an indication that there is a bit of a sack coach effect, because you'd only sack the coach if you're probably not going to win next week. So if you raise that up to 50-50. I had a look at it. The game plan didn't look much better, but I tell you what, there was some younger blokes who got a bit more of a go, and they were pretty good.
Oh, and Patrick Cripps just, the man just drove him in the last quarter. It was an extraordinary performance from him. Probably Ollie Florence best game for Carlton. It definitely was. He was probably best on the ground. A lot of those awards went to Paddy Cripps, but we got a lovely little wingman there, Jack.
Yeah, he looks pretty good.
Beautiful left foot kick, and the bloke who debuted, Jack Ison, who's a Parkside boy. Jack, we used to play Parkside in the Ammos. Terrifying.
Yeah, I tell you what,
I think it's a different club now.
Some of my mates who played in the amateur footies, a lot of them had hamstring twinges on the Thursday night before Parkside.
Yeah, there was some. It was it was one of those occasions where you could be forgiven for not putting your head over the footy.
Yeah.
But
he was good. He looked okay to me.
Yeah, he's got a beautiful left foot on him as well, and so it's nice to see some of the young kids going. Look, we're not expecting too much. They play Port Adelaide this weekend in Adelaide, and it'll be a bit of a test for him. Jacob Wiedering has been not so well rested. He's got a bit of a calf injury, so that will make it very difficult for him. Richmond play Essendon tonight, Jack, and I don't really need you to tip me a win. I'm just sort of thinking like, who wins, who loses? Because whoever loses is going to win the wooden spoon. You'd imagine.
Yeah, you would think so.
And it's a little bit sad. I know Richmond are going around it the right way, and I think Essendon have got to rebuild. There's a strategy there. I was wondering if there was around Essendon, but there is. I watched them play last week. And there is, this sort of blooding young kids getting some games under their belts, and they've got some good tall forwards and people coming through. But the big game, Jack, will be at Geelong v Sydney.
Yes,
not many go there and win. In fact, you've got to ask yourself if they play 7 games at Geelong, that's basically 6 games they can bank. The 6 wins they can bank.
Yeah, Sydney's record at GMHBA is pretty good, but of the visiting teams. But even so, you would expect Geelong to win that. Right.
They're in very good form. They Brisbane Lions had beaten Collingwood, giving them a hiding actually, and then came up against Geelong at Brisbane, and they were really stitched up. And it's a very different Geelong side now, isn't it? They've got some good young players with plenty of speed and put plenty of speed on the ball, and they're never going to be short of forward options. I noticed Tyson Stengel, who had an outstanding final series 3 years ago. He's back at training now, and he's had some rather historic problems, emotional problems, and came across from Adelaide, where I think Eddie Betts, a wonderful Eddie, mentored him a bit. And he had
Eddie was working for Geelong at the time, I think, and took
in that mentoring type role, and took Tyson under his wing. And
Geelong have an outstanding record for being able to reinvent themselves on the run. And also of looking after troubled kids.
We used to say this about Sydney, that they didn't have a rebuild. Well, history would tell you otherwise. But Geelong, I think they've only missed the finals once in the last 15 years. So anyway, a big week of AFL coming. And now racing, Jack, there's a Peter Lawrence, who's a horse racing fan. I don't know who he is, but he says it's literally incredible how the racing industry has allowed itself to be positioned like this, and the greatest lobbying success story in my lifetime by the pubs and poker machine lobby to somehow shift all the focus of problem gambling onto sports and race betting. The literally insane hysteria around problem gamblers in this area, whilst the actual main focus of the vast majority of problem gamblers, poker machines, get a free pass. No intelligent, sane person who actually understands gambling would conceive such a situation could possibly exist. But here we are. This is very, very sensible to me. I dislike the way you use the word whilst, Peter, but you would say while. We're not in the fucking 17th century. But, that's absolutely right. When we talk about problem gambling, we are very lucky in this country. by the way, is that we have the state of Western Australia only allows poker machines to be played in casinos. There's no real licensed club structure or anything like that, but there's a little bit of it. But you don't see poker machines there. You don't see poker machines in pubs. So we get two sets of data in this country, Jack. And when we talk about problem gambling, problem gambling itself is a little bit difficult because people have to self-identify as problem gamblers, and problem gamblers probably not going to always self-identify as problem gamblers. But when we do look at that set of data, what we'll find is the rate of problem gambling in Western Australia without poker machines substantially is less than 1% of the population. In New South Wales, where poker machines have been everywhere for the last 25 years, rate of problem gambling is just under 5%. So that's the data. That's the data that says you've got the problem around these things. But unfortunately, our state governments, with the exception of the Western Australian government, have become addicted to the revenue.
Yes. The other difference I would say is that, how would I put it? I'd say that racing gamblers, by and large, are combatants. They know what they're doing. They know they're there to gamble. An awful lot of people who get themselves into trouble with poker machines don't really think they're gambling. They're just having a little bit of fun in the club or the pub.
Well, it's not something, Jack. If you're a punter on the races, you'll have a bet on a race and you'll know there won't be another race for 10, 15 minutes, even if you're betting around the country, right? With a poker machine, if you set it up with all the options and so forth, you can go grand, and it's not long before you've dropped 200 and then you're in all sorts of trouble. With horse racing, I mean, yes, there can be a lot of tail chasing and those sorts of things, but you at least have to wait, take a deep breath before you place your next bet. All right. Okay, well, that takes us out for today. I want to thank...
Just one thing before we go.
One more thing?
Yeah. It's something that's from ancient history, but it made me giggle. A JFK conspiracy theorist dies and goes to heaven. At the pearly gates, St. Peter's having a day off, so God greets him. Right? Welcome. You are permitted to ask me one question, which I will answer truthfully. The man asks, who really shot Kennedy? God replies, Lee Harvey Oswald shot him from the 6th floor of the Texas School book depository. There were no accomplices. He acted alone. The man paused and said, shit, this goes higher up than I thought.
I know. I've written about that. And Lee Harvey Oswald pulled the trigger. There's no doubt. Yeah. And, then we have all sorts of conspiracies as to who motivated him and who got him there. Maybe that's a somewhat more complex story, but Lee Harvey Oswald was the trigger man. You can take that as read, listeners. Okay. Well, that does now take us out, and I want to thank Jack, Hong Kong Jack, for his opinions today, and we want to encourage our listeners to chuck us a few ideas our way. Not that we're bereft of them, but we would love to hear from you, things that we want to discuss. As I say, next week we will be looking at Sir Keir Starmer. We might have another little subtopic in there, but if there's something that you want us to go through and explain, examine the goods and bads of, we'll happily do that too. So you know how to get hold of us by now. You can get hold of me on Twitter. You can get hold of us on email on the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com.au. So there you are. And thanks for listening, folks. And we will talk to you next week. See ya.